The final reckoning, the mass execution of Nazi generals and officers. History is filled with moments of reckoning, where justice finally catches up to those who have committed unimaginable crimes. One of the most chilling and symbolic moments of World War II's aftermath was the execution of Nazi generals and officers, high-ranking individuals responsible for the deaths of millions. These men, once symbols of terror and power, faced their own mortality as they stood on the gallows, some so overwhelmed with fear that they lost control of their bodies in their final moments. The road to justice, the Nuremberg Trials. After the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945, the Allied powers sought to hold the architects of the Holocaust and the war accountable. The Nuremberg Trials, held between 1945 and 1946, were unprecedented in scope and impact. For the first time in history, international courts prosecuted leaders for crimes against humanity, setting a precedent for future war crimes tribunals. Among those sentenced to death were high-ranking Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and several others who had orchestrated mass murder, genocide, and brutal military campaigns. These men had stood at the pinnacle of the Nazi regime, wielding immense power over life and death. Now they faced the very justice they had denied millions. The last moments, fear and humiliation. On October 16, 1946, 10 convicted Nazi officials were executed by hanging in Nuremberg prison. Unlike the military-style firing squad some had requested, the method of execution was deliberately chosen to strip them of any remaining sense of dignity. As the moment approached, reports suggest that many of these once-feared leaders were overcome with terror. Some reportedly wet themselves in fear, their final minutes a stark contrast to the dominance they had once displayed. They had commanded armies, signed death warrants, and led a war machine responsible for the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century. But in the face of death, they were reduced to trembling figures awaiting the inevitable. The long drop, a grim end. The executions were carried out in a manner that some historians describe as particularly brutal. Unlike the swift drop designed for instant death, the method used at Nuremberg sometimes resulted in prolonged suffering. Witnesses reported that some of the condemned men took several minutes to die, their bodies convulsing on the ropes. One of the most notorious figures, Hermann Göring, escaped this fate by committing suicide the night before his scheduled execution, ingesting cyanide in his cell. His final act of defiance denied the world the image of his downfall on the gallows. But for the others, there was no escape. Their deaths were a stark reminder that even the most powerful figures in history are not beyond the reach of justice. A symbolic end to a dark chapter. The mass execution of Nazi generals and officers marked the conclusion of a dark era, symbolizing the triumph of justice over tyranny. Their fear, humiliation, and ultimate fate stood in contrast to the countless innocent victims who had faced death with no trial, no justice, and no mercy. Today, the Nuremberg Trials remain a cornerstone of international law, reminding the world that justice, however delayed, will always seek those who believe they are untouchable.